Attwood Unleashed number 42, expanded to a regular 4 hours now, thanks to the help of others who are really just the viewers have been all over Dr. Das asking us to get him on more and more and more. And he has his own YouTube channel, A Psych for Sore Minds. And I urge people to support what he's doing and to subscribe because he's been an absolute star, regaling us with all of his case studies and commenting on some of the biggest stories in true crime. And tonight's story that we're going to be discussing after a little bit of Decahegi is going to be Dalian Atkinson, who was tasered and kicked in the head by the police in the UK and died from his injuries. This is the tragic death of a footballer. So Dr. Das will be in the first 30 minutes. Then we're going over to guest Stefani Mawizi. Then we'll be talking about, she worked on WikiLeaks and Snowden stuff. She's going to be talking about Assange. Then third guest in the first 2 hours is Naima Kate on Incels. And I skipped, sorry, the second guest is Dr. Peter Hostian, who you may have seen on Joe Rogan. And he is going to be talking about woke ideology. Ooh. That should be interesting. I know the flat earth guy got a massive response. Loads of questions from the viewers. So 8 o'clock, we switch to Patreon. Addy Ads is convening a roundtable on the M trial. Then, if you're a Making a Murderer fan, and that was one of the biggest things on the channel in its early days of when it was starting to rise, Jerry Buting, Stephen Avery's lawyer, is joining us at 9:20 on Patreon. All right, so huge thank you for coming back on.
It's an absolute pleasure, Sean. Always a pleasure. Love being on your channel. Love interacting with your viewers. You've got some of the most passionate fans in the true crime space on YouTube, I think.
Oh, thank you. And this Decahegi stuff, there's like conspiracy theory videos have been popping up all week saying that I'm in some kind of puppet master position whereby I've got you to go and interview Decahegi in to try and like help him. This is their words, like clean him up or something because of the allegations against him. So I first found out that you were interviewing him. It just popped up on my phone. I had no idea that you were interviewing him. I did watch it. I enjoyed it. And the thing is, I must have interviewed 1,000 different people on this channel. So any collaborations they do with people that are disliked, I'm responsible.
Well, I have to say, if you are a puppet master, then you're really good at your job because you did it without my knowledge.
Could you tell me how that interview with Decahegi came out? Because the last thing I did with Decahegi was a live stream with Steve Rafe. This was quite a while ago, I think. And Deca changed his number after that. And I've not got his number, so I've not been able to speak to him.
Yeah.
But apparently I'm in constant contact with him, coming up with diabolical schemes.
So I was actually a guest on his channel, first of all. I think I got the connection through your good self, just because I'm always looking for platforms to talk about my work. I frankly didn't know that much about his background, really, apart from a couple of clips I'd seen on his channel. And then I repurposed that material by just having clips of it on my channel. Unbeknownst to me, he'd been arrested like maybe 2 days before I did that. And then I started getting all these comments in the YouTube comment section saying, have you heard what's happened? How can you be associated with this man? So I looked into it. There was very little information. There still is, at least in mainstream media. There's a lot of rumor mongering going on, but there's very little information about what he actually has or hasn't done. So I thought I would give him the opportunity to speak, and he came on as a guest. His video that I did with him, I think it was over a week ago now, got by far the most views that I've ever got, and by far the most vitriol and hatred and trolls that I've ever had by a long way. I'd say maybe about a quarter of the comments were relatively supportive and 3/4 of them were like really quite scathing.
So is that like a Pyrrhic victory then? Everyone is satisfied when they got a record-breaking views video on the channel, but to have the ratio of nasty comments come in, does that kind of mar that occasion? And does it make you want to continue to do videos of that genre, or does it put you off all the nastiness?
Well, the thing is my channel is about, as if your viewers have seen it, it's mostly about sort of high profile true crime cases and my own psychoanalysis of cases that I've seen on behalf of the criminal court as an expert witness. And I do interview people occasionally, but that's not what I do that often. So I thought Decker Heggie was a suitable person to interview because he's got experience with true crime and because he's got mental health issues. So it's literally my crossover. But I don't want it to be a kind of trashy channel that just gets lots of attention by having these really controversial guests. So I want to steer away from that. But if I'm being perfectly honest, I mean, it's nice to have a lot of views, but I'm genuinely fascinated in why people care so much and why he's attracted so much hatred. It still doesn't make sense to me. So I'm kind of torn on, like, I've got a devil on my shoulder sort of trying to pull me in and getting me to do more videos and reaction videos to the trolls. And I have a lot to say. I have a lot of opinions on what's been going on. But, you know, I've got an angel on my other shoulder telling me to purify my channel by staying away from
Perhaps I should be the devil on your shoulder, suggesting maybe we should do like a joint live stream on the psychology behind that. I think that would be absolutely fascinating. People are asking who is Decker and what we're talking about. So Decker Heggie was a podcast guest I had on about 2 or 3 years ago. Wildman co-hosted it in the Liverpool studio. And Decker, he's a fighter. He fought a guy recently. That the video went viral. He's like a bare knuckle fighter. But what he did was he started a YouTube channel, and it was like a social experiment in courting controversy. Because, you know, in the Robert Greene book, he says court controversy at all costs. But when we asked him about this situation, you have to draw a line and work that in coordination with the other rules in his book. So Decker Heggie, it seems that he courted so much controversy that it set a fire alight that he couldn't put out.
Yeah.
And he ended up, you know, he said on recent videos, he ended up depressed. He thought that the trolling was trying to push him to commit suicide and all this kind of stuff. And we're just observing the situation and reporting on it. So I think that will be a great joint live stream, Sohom, to just to try and analyze the psychology behind the hysteria. Yeah. So he was, in response to what you said, you don't understand what all the interest is. He generated that interest by courting that controversy and calling the trolls out and all this stuff. But I don't think he anticipated the full consequences in his life, the blowback.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. So, thing about Decker, and I discussed this with him during my interview. He's no angel. You know, he was a professional, an underground bare knuckle boxer, covered in tattoos. He was a self-confessed cocaine addict for 10 years. So I wasn't expecting him to, you know, sing on the church choir. I know he's probably done a few dodgy things in his life, and I'm sure he'd admit to that. And he's offended. But I think where the crux of the matter lies in the fact that he's offended, including some sexual offences, but he's had minimal punishment for them. So I think he's had a fine and he's had like probation. But there's a lot of rumours going on about, which I think are false allegations about him being, you know, a paedophile and a rapist, etc., etc. And he made a very good point, which is, I've been to court. The police have got all the information. If what all these trolls are saying is true, if I've done this and this, I wouldn't be walking the street. I would be locked up in prison. And I agree with that. I don't see why people can't take the word of mainstream media and can't take the word of the courts. I don't understand why the average troll thinks that their own investigation supposedly is more valuable than that. Doesn't make sense to me.
Have you read The Crowd by Le Bon?
No.
So in Le Bon, because I had to read it for stock market crowd psychology purposes, and Le Bon stated that the IQ of the crowd goes down to the lowest common denominator when crowd psychology takes over, and individuals would say things and behave in ways they wouldn't normally behave or do those things if they were acting individually. And what you see is people that wouldn't even qualify to go on Jerry Springer or Jeremy Kyle shows talk with the authority of people with criminology PhDs, and they do it so assertively, it sucks a lot of people in.
Yeah.
All right, should we move on to our next subject then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is
Dalian Atkinson.
Dalian Atkinson. Who was Dalian Atkinson, and when did this tragedy happen?
So Dalian Atkinson was a English professional footballer. He played as a striker. He played for lots of different teams: Ipswich Town, Sheffield Wednesday, Aston Villa. I think he actually won the League Cup with them. He's even played abroad: Spain, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. And what happened is that in August 2016, so it's quite a while ago now, the police were called to a disturbance at his father's house, I believe. And it seems like Atkinson was in a mental health crisis. So he was causing a ruckus outside on the street in Telford in Shropshire, and he was shouting out, claiming to be the Messiah. So what happened was that one police officer arrived on the scene, fired like a taser. I think the first 2 times it didn't work, and the third time he tasered Atkinson for about 33 seconds, which is an extraordinarily long period of time. It's about 6 times longer than is what is normal. And then, get this, he kicked him in the head twice, to the degree that he had blood on his laces, and he left like a boot imprint on the victim's head. And when the second police officer arrived on the scene, the first police officer had his foot on top of Atkinson's head.
So I had videos on my channel of guards murdering prisoners, mentally ill prisoners in the jail that I was at, the infamous Sheriff Joe Arpaio's jail, Maricopa County Jail, Phoenix, Arizona. And I saw that guards, when a mentally ill person acts up, if one guard starts to like attack that person, then the others join in. For example, there was one where the guy was dead from the actions of the guards. They'd been beating him and tasering him, and they couldn't stop. They were like a pack of wolves. They couldn't stop, and a female guard tried to stop it. She goes, "Look, his face has turned blue. Stop!" And they couldn't stop. They pushed her off. The inmates started yelling, "Why are you still beating him? He's already dead," and they still couldn't stop. So obviously, most guards, well-meaning, they go into a dangerous environment. They're probably on edge all day, adrenaline firing. I imagine the cops, similar situation, well-meaning, but once that certain part of the brain kicks in, perhaps you could expand on this. I'm just shooting from the hip here. Is it the amygdala?
Yeah.
And it turns you into more of an animal attack mentality.
Yeah.
Do you want to help me out with that?
Yeah. So I'll come back onto that in a sec. So I totally agree. I think we should acknowledge that the police, and in this particular case, he probably came into a situation where he genuinely felt threatened and he felt like he was in danger. I think that's fair, because I think that when people present as agitated, it's not always clear if they're suffering from a mental illness. They could be dangerous people. They could be there to hurt you, especially if they look threatening. So you're right. Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in. So your blood pressure rises. You get adrenaline, noradrenaline. Your muscles tense up. So it's like fight or flight, and you're geared for fight. So that's not the bit that's confusing or shocking or unusual in that case. The fact that happened is expected. But after he tasered the man, after he tasered Atkinson, Atkinson was on the floor, and he still carried on kicking him whilst he was on the floor in the head. I mean, I don't think there's any perspective where that is not excessive force. So he wasn't doing it at that point because he was in fear of his life. He might have been a few moments before, but I just can't see how it can be excused. And he actually manslaughter, so he's getting 8 years in prison. It's the first time that's happened in decades to a police officer.
So how do you prevent that then? Because if you're at police training camp and you're reenacting these situations, you know that it's not the real world, and your brain chemicals are going to be at a certain level. Get in the real world, different ball game.
Yeah.
The guards, who I saw, they were tasering, beating, strangling. A corpse? How do you put a circuit breaker in the brain when you're just all out animal to stop guards and police going that far? How does a well-meaning person put a circuit breaker in the brain to stop them murdering someone like that?
I think there are solutions or strategies, but the problem is they're complicated and they take a long time and they cost a lot of money. So I'm a forensic psychiatrist now, as you know. When I was a registrar, which is like a middle grade psychiatrist, me and a colleague of mine tried to make a police training module to teach them about presentations of mental illness. And we actually met with the clinical director of the Met Police. And it was shocking how little training police officers get. Is literally like 1 or 2 afternoons in a week of induction, and that's it. That's all the mental health training they have. So that's the first problem, I think, is that they actually don't know how to recognize somebody that's in a mental health crisis, that's, you know, for example, hearing voices or suffering from paranoid delusions, as opposed to somebody that's just angry and just wants to hurt them for whatever reason. So that's one big step. I think another kind of wider social construct is the stigma of mental illness. So I think that there is still a massive stigma against mentally ill people committing violence. And I think the police is quite a macho kind of culture, isn't it? So I think that they probably perpetuate the stigma within their own culture. And the other thing I'd say is that actually there are strategies that already exist. They just are not being used effectively. So to give you a specific example, the police have a section of the Mental Health Act that's just for use for them. It's called a Section 136. And it means if they're presented with a case like Dalian Atkinson, of somebody who's agitated, who at least on the surface looks as if they might be mentally ill, so a really good example, then they, instead of arresting them and you know, bundling them into a police van, after they've calmed them down, they can take them to a place of safety. So that can be like A&E, where they're in a secure area, and then a psychiatrist comes out and assesses them and decides there and then whether they should be sectioned to hospital. So it's like a quick way of diverting mentally ill people. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is I don't think it's so much changing this with education. I think there's areas that are lacking, but with how you actually treat mentally ill people, if you're a policeman, I think there are strategies in place. They're just not being utilized. You know, if you go in heavy-handed and just beat somebody up rather than try and take them from assessment, then it doesn't matter how good the system is behind you. It's always going to fail, isn't it?
Well, are you saying that it's an institutional problem then, if they're not being trained adequately? And if so, when there is a death, who's responsible?
I think it is
the lack of training. Does that play a role in the court process? Would the person get a mitigating circumstance off that?
So I think that lack of training and lack of education is a massive factor. I don't think it's the only factor. I think things like the culture within the police, as we were talking about before, is another huge one. Just to go off piece for a second, you might find this interesting. So when me and my colleague tried to build this module to help teach the police, it was actually quashed by some of my senior colleagues within the system that I worked in. And they didn't tell me this directly, but I'm pretty confident it's because we weren't going to make any money off it. So me and my friend were willing to give up our free time to give these sessions within the scope of our job, but we were told, no, we're not really that interested. So I think there's kind of bigger behind it, such as people wanting to make money. But to answer your question, I think one of the problems is that it's something that's in the culture of some police officers. But when something like this happens, so Monk was the name of the police officer that killed Dalian Atkinson, then they're kind of pushed away, and the whole police force tries to distance themselves and say that it's one rotten apple. And I think, I'm not saying that he isn't a rotten apple. I think, you know, unquestionably what he did was unnecessary and it was excessive force. So I don't disagree with that. But what I'm saying is, if you push somebody away and say it's just his problem, it's not our problem, then the situation's never going to improve. Whereas if you accept there's a problem in the culture and a lack of training and education, that's the first step to take before you try and improve the whole system.
So what professional experiences have you had with the police?
So with the police, most interactions I've had is when they've brought people into hospitals that I was working in on a Section 136. So either they were agitated, or sometimes people were picked up like naked, roaming around on the streets, or muttering to themselves, or not making any sense. And sometimes we'd see people after suicide attempts. That was very common. So policemen would catch them, like either they've had an overdose or an attempted hanging. There've been a couple of occasions where police officers have actually stopped people jumping off bridges, literally, and then brought them into the hospital that I work in, and I have to do the first assessment to see whether they're sectionable or not. And I have to say that most of the police officers that I worked with are pretty decent. I think they're, especially with suicide attempts, because I think if somebody's been aggressive, then they feel wronged, regardless, the police officers that is, regardless of whether the person has a mental illness or not, because they feel challenged, and probably related to their macho culture, they push back and they kind of, you know, throw the patient in and say, you know, fuck this guy, you deal with him. Whereas if it's post-suicide attempts, they have a lot more empathy. But one of the main issues we had with the police officers is that it's a massive impingement in their time to bring somebody into hospital, because they can't just drop them off and leave. They have to stay until the psychiatrist comes. In case that person leaves the A department, then the police officer is responsible for them. And if they've just tried to commit suicide, then you can't just let them wander the streets. And because there's usually one psychiatrist on call covering lots of different wards, the police officer might have to wait like 2, 3, 4 hours. So there was some tension in between them wanting to leave so they can, and I understand that. I think that's reasonable, because they wanted to get on with their job, and us having to hurry up our other assessments to get to see their patients as soon as possible.
So how do you think this case is going to play out?
Well, he's already got 8 years. He got manslaughter with diminished responsibility. I don't think he's going to have a very good time in jail. You know, being a police officer, having killed a black man, it's quite a high-profile case. He's not going to be able to hide who he is. I imagine he'll probably have to go on a vulnerable prisoner's wing. I imagine he's going to be a target. So that's what I foresee in his future. In terms of the future of the police force in itself, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to shit all over the police, because I know there's good officers as well as bad, but it does seem like there's just controversy after controversy after controversy, from Wayne Couzens to, you know, case after case of police misconduct. So I don't know whether anything is going to change the police, some of the malignant culture within the police. What do you think? Do you think they can change, or they will change?
I think human nature is immutable. So any bureaucracy is going to have mismanagement, and there's going to be situations like this. You got a lot of careerists and masons, and there's all kinds of cross currents and influences running through the police that makes them sometimes not do the things that the public are desiring them to do. So, you know, I'm a member of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, which is cops, judges, prosecutors. And some of those cops say they joined to get the bad guys, the pedos, the killers, things like that. But they were assigned to infiltrate a student group, get them smoking weed, and arrest them all at the end of the month. To me, that is an absolute waste of taxpayers' resources. But apparently, due to the war on drugs, which we're campaigning against, the more arrests they make, the more federal funding they get in America. So there's a direct incentive with arrest quotas to go after the lowest hanging fruit. Yeah. And I was deeply saddened by a video on Vice, I think it was a couple of years ago, whereby a baby-faced undercover cop went into a school, coerced special needs kids into getting him drugs and stuff. They arrested like 20 plus special needs kids. And then the big news headline was dangerous crack dealing gang, you know, peddling class 1 drugs and weapons in this school. And Vice showed the kids that they coerced and how the whole thing went down. Yeah. And they explained it's all about the federal funding. If you want to rise up in the cops, if you want to get more money from the federal government, lowest hanging fruit. And sadly, that's young people with drugs. So I would like to see the police go back to going after the true bad people. And the whole purpose of the prison system as well was to take people out of society that harm other people. Yeah. If you look at how crime has been defined for millennium, rape, robbery, murder, person A harms person B. And what we got now, low-level drug users, the mentally ill. If you arrest someone with weed, for example, possession, who's that person harming? So the whole purpose of the prisons and the police, from what I see, has been grossly subverted by the war on drugs. And all those resources, if you end the war on drugs, you could take all those resources to going after the seriously bad people. but we're getting told, you know, the government doesn't have enough resources to go after. I'll just say that word instead. People who harm kids. Yeah. So it's all upside down from what I can see.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said, Sean. I think another issue when we're talking about individual police officers, I think is similar to prison officers, which is that if you don't pay them enough, then you're only going to attract a certain caliber of individual, aren't you? So if you pay I think the police are underpaid. I think prison officers are as well.
Well, definitely. And the guy we interviewed recently, Lee Davies, he was getting 18k starting salary, and the gang was offering him £500 to bring in packages, and he could bring up to 3 packages a day. So he started smuggling drugs in to supplement his income.
Yeah. And I think it's going to be a really uphill struggle to try and change the internal culture if you don't make them feel valued by paying them what they're worth. And I think when they're in a situation where they're facing potential violence every single day, then they need to have an incentive to turn up to work.
So we've got a couple of minutes left before the next guest. Please support Dr. Das on his YouTube channel, A Psych for Poor Minds. And during this discussion, comments are coming in calling us Decaheggy cheerleaders. What do you say to that, Dr. Das?
I don't think there's anything that we can possibly say that's going to stop some of these trolls. So you're very welcome. Thank you for your feedback, trolls.
Should we do a live stream next week on this then? I think we can take questions and try and psychoanalyze online hysteria and lynch mobs.
Yeah, I'm up for that.
Put Decaheggy in the title there, and we should get a fair old amount of interest. All right, so do you want to tell the viewers, more about what you're doing on your channel before the next guest comes in?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, it's called A Psych for Sore Minds, and it's just everything that I do for a living, which is I assess and rehabilitate mentally disordered offenders. So I see people in courts and in prisons. So what have I got recently? I've just released a video on Catherine Knight, who is the first woman in Australia to get a full life sentence because she decapitated her husband and tried to cook his head and feed it to her children. I shit you not. I did a video on John Wayne Bobbitt, which is an infamous case I'm sure that you and many of your viewers would have heard of. So that's a woman who cut off her husband's penis. Not all my videos are about husbands being dismembered. I've got videos on individual diagnoses and on criminality in general. So anything to do with offending and to do with mental illness and the crossover between the two. I release 2 videos a week on a Tuesday and a Friday. You should go and check it out.
I was in America when all that John Wayne Bobbitt stuff went down, and I don't know whether he had it reattached or he had an enlargement, but didn't he become a porn star? But then he ended up depressed and alcoholic and abusing future partners. And the wife, she went on, I think she was on Oprah Winfrey and all this stuff.
So I discussed this in my video, but it seems that the wife was a lot classier. So she turned down a lot of media initially, and she only did the fairly more sophisticated end of the spectrum, should we say. Whereas John Wayne Bobbitt himself, he was just up for doing everything from porn to trashy TV shows. He clearly was using the opportunity to become as famous as he could be.
What do you think of her defense then?
So I think that people kind of laugh at the whole situation and see her as a bit unhinged and a bit crazy. But as I discussed in my video, she was actually the victim of repeated sexual abuse from him over years, physical, emotional, and sexual. And as you said, afterwards, he went on to sexually abuse other people, and he ended up in prison because of that. So there's obviously a pattern. But she got a psychiatric defense because she was temporarily psychotic. So she still had to go to prison for a while, but then she had to go to hospital for a little while as well before she got released. And
what do you think about his sad later years?
So I think he's just a bit of a nasty man, really. I mean, what happened to him was a bit intense, and there's a pretty harsh punishment for anybody. But before and afterwards, he had a long history of being abusive to a number of different partners. So it just kind of fits a pattern, really. I think he had his 15 minutes of fame, and then just got a bit more forlorn and disattached from society. He's in prison right now, I believe.
Is he? Oh my goodness.
Sexual abuse. Yeah.
So tomorrow at 6 p.m, we've got a podcast coming out with Gary Rogers, ex-Greater Manchester Police, and he's completely exposing the Freemasons in Greater Manchester Police and how they concocted a conspiracy against him. It's absolutely fascinating to hear that from an insider because there's so many conspiracy theories about the Freemasons. So, Dr. Das, in your interactions with the police, prison staff, etc., were you ever invited into the Freemasons?
I can't tell you if I was. But if you're the puppet master that everyone says that you are, then you're probably a Freemason yourself.
Not only are you a Decahegi cheerleader, you're a Freemasonic Decahegi cheerleader.
If you look at the YouTube comments that I've got, I'm a lot worse than that
as well. What do you think then about secret societies in general?
I don't know that much about them, to be honest. I'm very intrigued by them. I'd like to know a bit more about them, and also I'd like to know how they operate. I'd like to know about the power struggle. But also, there is a grey area between them and cults, I suppose, isn't there? I mean, cults are not as secretive, but I'm sure some of the same psychological processes apply, like somebody in power, in total dominance, being worshipped, and having people look up to them.
It'd be good to do a live stream on secret societies at some point as well. Well, our next guest has arrived, so I'm going to bump you off, Sohom.
Okay.
And then you're going to come back in 30 minutes.
All right. Enjoy, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Okay, let's just remove him. There we go. All right. So you may have seen our next guest on Joe Rogan. Hey, Peter, how's it going?
Hey, Sean, how are you?
Great. Whereabouts in the world are you? Which state?
At the moment, I'm in Portland, Oregon, and I'm hoping to leave as soon as possible, as every sane person I know. It's actually almost every single person I know from the middle class wants to leave Portland.
Are you going to become a snowbird and move down to Arizona, where I lived for 17 years?
No, I might get just the smallest of small places in Austin, and then I'm very fond of Washington. But I think Oregon, I've had it with Portland. Yeah. The mayor has, well, it's a long story, probably bore you, but the crime, the violence, the homelessness, I've never seen anything like it in my life. Just driving around is every day. I'm just stunned. Whenever I drive up to Washington on I-5, I always feel so tense, and I just figured out why. It's like you just see just miles of just trash and filth. But anyway, so I'm in Portland, but I'm leaving. I'm probably going to sell my house pretty soon, and I'm very excited about that. And I'm moving on to greener pastures. Nothing's keeping me here anymore.
Oh, well, good luck with that, and congratulations on your phenomenal YouTube success. I watched your stuff with Joe Rogan over the years, and I was mesmerized by how you put those studies into academia and really showed people up for what they were.
Yeah, we have a lot of pretentious charlatans running around pretending to know things that they don't know. And they've managed to successfully hoodwink really a generation of people into believing things that are totally untethered to reality. So, yeah, it's good. It's good. That was, I think, 2018. And now we're 2022, and we've seen what happens from, oh, this is a small fringe group of people in the academy. It will never leak out. Don't worry about it. To look what we have today. And actually, Mike Nana's new film, we'll discuss that. That's coming out, I think, in February. He's going to discuss that in detail.
I also commend you for your work in the prisons. I don't know if you're familiar with my story, but I made a lot of money in the stock market. It went to my head. I started to throw raves, import ecstasy, ended up in Sheriff Joe Arpaio's jail for that. And I heard all of the prisoners' stories. And before I got arrested, I thought prisons are full of pedophiles, murderers, serial killers, etc. But average arrest was like a black kid or a Mexican kid with a little bit of drugs. And these people, a lot of them have been thrown away as kids, or they'd suffered horrific childhood abuse.
Correct.
And it opened my heart to what was really going on in the world with all these predatory corporations making money off the back of warehousing these people. So how did you end up teaching in prison then? Which prison was that?
So I did my dissertations in prisons and here in Multnomah County in Portland, Oregon. I'm just watching all of these. Should we be commenting or looking at the things on the side, or no?
I wouldn't let it distract you. You can
all right.
check it out
distracting,
later on.
Okay. Hey, everybody. So I did my dissertation at Columbia River Correctional Institution, and then I later went on to chair a committee, the Prison Advisory Committee. But it's fascinating. Many of at the time it was an all-male facility. Many of the men in that facility, boy, they were really they had, as you said, brutally difficult lives. It's called ACEs, and basically it's a crime predictor. There are so many criminogenic factors, like you're 7 times more likely to go to prison if one of your parents has gone to prison or is currently incarcerated, and that number multiplies. We could actually linger on this subject if you want for a bit, because it's something very few people talk about because of the nature of it's a very dark subject, and people just want to kind of think it's over there. And again, from this one prison, 75 to 80% of the people at the time were, I live in Multnomah County, Portland is in Multnomah County. They were re-released to the county. And so these are your neighbors, these are people in your community. And we also know from the literature, the data is very, very, very crystal clear, actually. A very small amount of money can help people, can help inmates. But the problem is every time those measures come up in bonds or what have you, nobody wants higher taxes. So they're always voted down consistently, which is really a shame. So one thing, just to linger on that for a second, that very few people talk about. We know the predictors for violent crime. We know what they are. I mean, you could probably guess. I'm curious. I'll ask your audience who are just typing away out there. What do you think the 3 factors for to predict violent crime are? My guess is that your audience will be able to get 2, but nobody's going to get the 3rd. So we can linger on that or move on, but I want to see what your audience.
Let's linger, because it ties in with the mission statement on this channel. In the very beginning, we were interviewing people who got out of prison, trying to help them rebuild their lives and share their stories. It was cathartic for them. And after interviewing hundreds of people who've been in prison, it just became evident to me that childhood abuse was a major factor behind much crime. And then you've got them taking drugs because they don't have the tools to deal with that psychological trauma, which then leads to, for the men, robberies, car theft, burglaries, and for the women, sex work and shoplifting. I just saw this trajectory over and over and over again.
Right. You're not wrong, but that's not the top 3. I'll throw out the top 3. So there's a Greg Ellis that actually he's from your island there. He has a wonderful book called The Respondent on this, and there's another wonderful little book from Pitchstone Press coming out May 1st that I read the manuscript of. It's called The Gift of Violence by Matt Thornton. So here are the 3 factors. Most people will guess 2 of the factors. It's males. Men are just far more likely to engage, and we should actually talk about that as well. I didn't plan to talk about any of this stuff with you now, but it's okay. It's where it's going. And the other one is age. And if memory serves me correctly, I think it's 16 to 26. You're far more like, I'm 55. The number of people 55 arrested for violent crimes are at a trickle. But here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. To be blunt with you, I try to make this nonpartisan, but there is one side of the political aisle that simply does not want to speak about this, and it's whether or not an adult male is present in the home. That's the 3rd factor. And that's the factor that almost everybody ignores for political reasons, for social reasons.
Say that slowly. Whether or not an adult male is present in the home.
Correct.
So the absence of a father.
Yeah, and when you think about that, that should take a lot of the racial stuff away, right? That should take a lot of the arguments when people are actual racists out of the equation. So it's nothing to do with race. It's actually not even to do with systems in the broadest possible sense. Adult male, we know the data is crystal clear on that. Adult males in the home significantly decrease the likelihood that boys in particular will be predatory criminals, to be blunt.
So what is the purpose of prisons and the police? Because I believe it's been subverted by the war on drugs.
Oh, the war on drugs is an unmitigated catastrophe. And we could drill down on that. We could talk about that. And actually, another person on your island there, Johan Hari, has written elegantly about that on the Scream. And I just read his new book, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, we've had him on. He's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting about attention. And I actually didn't want to read it. I didn't want to believe it because I like being hooked to my devices. So that was kind of a slap. But so it depends, Foucault in Discipline and Punish, and there's a long pedigree in the literature about what people think that the purpose of prison inmates, the purpose of prisons should be. Should it be a deterrent? Should it be retributive, to punish? Should it be to give people a skill so when they come out they can do something? It all depends on one's view. I'm not. What do you think it is?
All right, so I'm a member of LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Drug Prohibition.
My buddy is an advisor to that. He's on the board.
And they say if you go back for millennia, crime has been defined as person A harming person B, rape, robbery, theft, whatever. But when you go after the lowest hanging fruit to fill the private prison systems, and that lowest hanging fruit is young people with weed possession, was one of the highest arrest categories in the history of criminal justice, hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million at the peak, a year. Who is that person harming if you arrest a kid with weed? And from my experience, I saw that weed head come into the jail, get recruited by skinhead gangs if they were white, the Aryan Brotherhood, tattooed them up with Hitler and swastikas and all kinds. Right. Approximately 90% of the prisoners were injecting heroin. They've got a criminal record. They make their criminal connections in prison. At the gate, they're given $50, told to have a nice day when they're exiting. And it's almost by design. They know when that $50 is gone, they've made a name for themselves in the prison system. They're outcasts now in society. They're basically clients for life with these private prisons.
Yeah, so in Oregon here, not only is marijuana legal, recreational marijuana and medical marijuana, but also small possessions of things like ecstasy, et cetera. They're not even misdemeanors. It's allowed. The war on drugs has been an unmitigated catastrophe. The idea that there are gateway drugs is totally false. Again, to mention Hari's work, he talks about the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but it's a kind of loneliness or lack of community or isolation from community. We see the fentanyl epidemic now, which is an utter catastrophe, and even traditional treatment modalities, buprenorphine right now. This is all outside my expertise. You're the people typing in the corner can take this for what it's worth.
This is what we want: original content.
Expertise. That's a treatment modality that the many in the medical community are slow to accept because it's a medical intervention as opposed to a talk intervention or a therapeutic intervention. But there's simply no question that not only has this been a fiasco economically, but it's also been a fiasco in terms of the adversarial relationship it creates with law enforcement. Particularly now, that's the last thing that we need. Now, in the UK, marijuana is not legal, is it?
It is not legal, and it's an absolute travesty when these politicians running the country have partaken in substances way stronger, and Correct. They're absolutely, just hypocritical to maintain it where it is. But your feds have still got it as a Schedule 1 substance, haven't they? More harmful than, is it crystal meth, and with no medicinal value whatsoever?
Is it? I don't think it was a Schedule. No, I don't think it is. I'm not sure. Common sense. I'm really happy you're a member of LEAP. I just spoke to the woman who ran that a few months ago about a project I was working on. But that's a really good organization in which it encourages responsible reform of law enforcement. And that's one of the main issues. Again, I can't speak to your country, but that's one of the main issues that's been on the left's agenda here, along with the utterly deranged idea of defunding the police, which is truly one of the stupidest ideas I've ever heard in my life.
Credit. Shout out to Neil Woods. Neil Woods, I think he started the LEAP in the UK. He's an ex-cop, and we've had him on a few times, and he's doing fantastic work across Europe.
It's interesting. The mayor of Portland to be blunt, he's a public disgrace. He's almost single-handedly destroyed the city. It's really rather remarkable accomplishment. Just as a side note, I've had people come to me and say more than one that this could not possibly be negligence. He's got to be in some foreign powers. Well, we bracket that for a second. But one of the things that he did was he eliminated the gun reduction task force. And again, the person I'd like to recommend for your show is Matt Thornton. He's Conor McGregor's coach's coach. He's a 5th degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and he trains law enforcement. And his work on violence and Black Bloc and Antifa and BLM is phenomenal, like truly next level stuff. But when you drill down on that data, you find some very, very interesting facts. But just to bracket, should we be looking at the comments on the side? Are you doing that for us?
I'm doing that for you, yes.
Okay. So back to the issue at hand. So the gun reduction task force, the mayor did away with it. And the reason the mayor did away with it, along with the city council, is because they claimed it was racist, because they had more contact with law enforcement. So what do you think? All right, people on the side typing away there. What do you think is let's see how long it would take. I'm going to ask another question after this. How long is it going to take your guest to figure this out? The gun reduction task force was eliminated because the mayor said that it was racist because it had disproportionate contact with African Americans. What do you think happened?
So did it got implemented then, and it got stopped, did it? It got stopped.
And what do you think happened? This is not a gotcha. It's not a trick question.
So did crime increase after it was stopped?
Correct. The murder rate went through the roof, and particularly the murder rate of young African Americans. So here's what's interesting to me, weaving together the previous conversation. So I had mentioned before that if an adult male is not present in the home, and I mentioned the criminogenic factors being age and whether or not one is a male or female. Those terms are so problematic nowadays, but males are far more likely to have contact with the police. Have you ever in your life heard a single person make the argument, literally ever from anybody, that the police are biased against males? Have you? No, I haven't either. Okay, so the police have more contacts with African Americans, but now we've crafted a narrative that the police have some kind of animus against African Americans. And if you drill down on the data, so this is another question for the people typing away there. How many people, and again, it's probably an unfair question because this is United States, but how many African Americans were killed, unarmed African Americans were killed by the police in 2019? Now, when you ask that question to people, again, I had no idea we were going to talk about any of this stuff, but when you ask that question to people, you would be astonished what the answer is. I asked my neighbor here, she said 22,500.
Wow.
So the answer is actually under 20, and it's between 8 and 16, depending on how you parse the data. So we have problems that people are simply not being honest about in this country, right? And we have narratives that have taken over for facts, but that's perfectly for in the 20s, right? In the late teens, like that's what we do. We turn to our subjective experience. We privilege, lived experience over everything, and data, et cetera. Those are tools of oppression of the patriarchy. So we have created this problem ourselves. We have nobody to blame for ourselves. We have a bunch of lunatics running around claiming that their subjective experience trumps any kind of objective reality or way to know reality, and then everybody else defers to them. So we have nobody to blame but ourselves.
Do you think that sometimes there's an accumulation of emotion? For example, in what you're citing, going back to like lynching and racism of the last century, and then you get like little trigger issues that open the floodgate, basically.
I think it's a complex combination of factors. I mean, that's clearly one of them, but the way to what the way to deal with this situation is. In fact, another person from your island, Helen Pluckrose, has written very eloquently about this in the last 2 chapters of Cynical Theories. Probably the best thing that I've read in the last literally a quarter century. She talks about the importance of liberalism and liberal values and basic freedoms, and we know how to solve these problems, and we know the values that we all share, independent of religion or creed or skin color. And we know the values to make the society more prosperous and to make it more just and to make it more fair. And we know, for example, in this country, we have Miranda rights. Like we know that there are some basic elements of civil society that we all have to abide by. And so somebody wrote about, tossing the statues, ripping the statues. I personally couldn't care less if the statues. I would kind of like some of the deer statues, but the anarchists and the black bloc, the far left, has ripped down the statues. Look, if you don't like the statues, this is the problem. We have also deferred to the juvenile rantings of a bunch of thugs in our cities. There are democratic ways and processes to take those statues down. You live in a democracy and you should play by the rules. So, of course, they'll tell you that the rules are inherently racist, but we have mechanisms and systems in place so that if you don't like statues, et cetera. Now, let's say that you try and you're unsuccessful and you can't rip down the statues. I mean, you can't have that taken. Run for office. Nothing is preventing anybody from running for office. In fact, the whole country, maybe at the upper levels, you need to be wealthy, but certainly in local office, nothing is preventing people from doing that. So if you don't have a certain statue, there are mechanisms. If you don't like it, there are mechanisms built into the city, into the structure of governance that you can take those down. But we've kind of deferred to mob rule. But if I may, here's the crazy thing. If I said to somebody, excuse me, often I lost my mom and dad, but I often think, wow, if my dad was like an old-fashioned liberal and he were listening to this, he would be just mortified at what was happening to the country. If you said to somebody, 10 years ago, hey, we got these people ripping stuff down in the city, assaulting people, maybe they have a good reason to do it, maybe they don't have a good reason to do it, what do you think should happen to them? Like, literally everybody would have said they should be given a trial, arrested, given a trial, and if they're found guilty, they should have some consequence. Maybe it's prison, maybe it's, repainting the stuff they've destroyed, whatever it is, depending on the severity. But now the narrative is anybody who thinks they should be arrested and put in jail are conservatives. So the narrative itself is flipped. No, they're not conservatives. They're just people who don't want the city to turn into a big cesspool. There are people who value basic law and order of not assaulting civilians walking down the street. But again, the narrative is if somebody pushes back on that, well, then the system is racist. You're defending a racist system. The police are defending a racist system. All ACAB, I don't know if you have that over there, but all cops are bastards. You saying that, and then somehow you are complicit in a racist systemic patriarchy.
Do you think there's always going to be anomalies and inefficiencies in society because of the interests of the lobbyists?
Yeah, I don't think any of these problems are caused by lobbyists. I can tell you exactly where they're caused from without any equivocation or question whatsoever. They're caused from deranged ideologies that are untethered to reality, that have seeped out of the academy because my former colleagues were teaching people things that were simply untrue, and they've done that for generations. And now the chickens have come home to roost. And now this is the fruits of it. This is critical race theory applied. This is race essentialism applied. This is dividing people intentionally on the basis of their race and calling it a virtue. This is weaponizing the word racism against everybody with whom you disagree. This is creating institutional mechanisms and weaponizing them to punish dissenters. This is the kind of civilization, this kind of society we've created.
We've already got a few minutes left, so on a lighter note, can I ask you some silly philosophical questions just based on my rudimentary knowledge?
Sure. I didn't anticipate to talk about that today.
If you're going to reach for a philosophy book, which of the ancient philosophers would you reach for?
Oh, that's the easiest question in the world. Socrates. No question about it. Everybody should read. If I were kind of the czar of education, everybody would be reading Socrates, Plato actually, but reading the Dialogues of Socrates.
Did you find Aristotle quite dry then, in comparison?
I did. I recognized the value of Aristotle. I liked his stuff on friendship and in the ethics, but Socrates is really where it's at. I mean, someone else from your island there, Whitehead, said all of philosophy are just footnotes to Plato and Aristotle. Very true.
So I think Tolstoy wrote something like the highest flight of wisdom is to admit that you know nothing. What would
Yeah,
your?
well,
What would,
I just saw a comment. Someone said Socrates, the man who hated democracy. It's about the Socratic method. It's about ways to ask questions and engage people, and that's what Socrates has given us. That's timeless. You can disagree with some of those conclusions, but it's the method of reasoning that were captured in those dialogues that's just timeless. And I would argue, to take the conversation to another level, that would be essential for any spacefaring civilization to possess. There's something in reason and rationality that are captured in those dialogues that are essential for human progress and flourishing.
and they're so compelling as well. So Nietzsche, I think you wrote something like, "What is life without music?" Do you subscribe to that? And what music preferences do you have?
I like heavy metal. I like very hard. I like Tool is my favorite band. Every once in a while, I'll if I had my own druthers when I go out to listen to stuff, I like to go to Irish bars and listen to Celtic music. But almost all the bars are closed here because of COVID.
What do you think of Kant's critique of pure reason?
Boy, I haven't thought about that in a while. I think it has elements of merit. I've never understood why people would posit realms that they like, the noumena and the phenomena of the noumena. Like I've never understood some of it. I found Kant to be clear in places. Sometimes I would, particularly in graduate school, I would just marvel at the man's genius. Yeah, I don't really think anything of it. I like philosophy that's practical and that helps people. That's what I'm drawn to.
Yeah, that's where I was getting to next, because Kant used a lot of Latin and hard to understand words. I can't remember the philosopher who said that if a philosopher's so bright, the common people should be able to understand what he's saying.
Yeah, and the French tradition is horrible for that. Dan Dennett tells a story when he talked to Foucault about why his writing is so unclear and obscure. And Foucault said, you won't be taken seriously in French if people don't understand 25% of what you write. But there is, and another person from your island, my friend Richard Dawkins, talks about the importance of clarity. And we've done a couple of events together, and he just gives some lovely, it's just so lovely. So there's a kind of pretension. People think, oh, if I just write in this way or this way, people will think I'm smart. Well, fuck whether or not people think you're smart. Write something that people can understand. Write something because it's clear. Don't write something because you want to impress someone else. That's one of the follies of youth, I think, of when you're younger. It's probably more, many young people think it's more important to be perceived as being intelligent. But if you really want to be perceived as being intelligent, then write clearly.
What do you think of existentialism and books like The Plague?
I have a very good friend of mine that's hardcore. Actually, he's written 40 books actually on it. 40 with a 40 in
Wow.
it.
That's a prison sentence right there.
I know. I understand its value in as they say in philosophy, since you're asking me philosophy, sub species eternitatis, like under the watchful eye of eternity. Like I think it has a value. There is something about existentialism and a kind of a self-consciousness or a self-awareness of our own existence and its finitude. And I think that I'm not sure how that moves the needle on ameliorating human suffering or or promoting human flourishing. But I'm neutral toward it. I think it has some value, but it's not something of which I find myself interesting.
Okay, with life affirmation, then human flourishing. Let's go to the Stoics.
I love. Someone wrote The Perfect Circle. Yes, The Perfect Circle is another one of my. I should curate my playlist. I don't know who would want to see them, and then post that here.
What did you think of the portrayal of Marcus Aurelius in the beginning of the movie The Gladiator?
Oh boy, that's another curveball question. I love The Gladiator. I thought that was a fantastic film. I like Russell Crowe. Almost everything he's done. I'm amazed at what a versatile actor he is. I love that scene when he said he wants to die a soldier's death, and he basically kills those guys.
I cried when they had his wife and his son strung up. I had tears in my eyes at that point.
Yeah, it was a great movie. I'm amazed. I mean, he's done some So this is a far-reaching interview. He's done some fantastic work. Yeah, I'd have to say I love his stuff. Big fan. The Matrix. I just saw the last Matrix. That movie was an abortion. My God.
Well, huge thank you, Peter. You've been an absolute riot. Glad that we got to cover some ground, some unusual ground, because I've watched, many of your other stuff, and I wanted to try and come at it at a different angle. Really a privilege to have you on after watching you on Joe Rogan and how esteemed you are. And if there's anything we can ever do for you, if you ever come to London, just give us a shout.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I should be there. My son will be living there pretty soon, and I should be there. So I'm definitely looking forward to it. I'm a big fan of the pubs. So when I come, why don't you email me and you have your assistant? My assistant will get out and I'll take you out for drinks. Big fan.
We'll take you for some fish and chips and a pint of Guinness.
Love that. Nothing happier. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Sean. I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks very much. Have a good evening. Cheers. Bye-bye. What a lovely chap. And we're going to bring in Dr. Das. He's back.
Hello again. How you doing?
Yeah, and we are also going to bring our next guest in, Stefania. And I'm going to have my break, and Dr. Das is going to take the lead. So here we go.
See you in a bit, Sean.
Cheers. Bye.
Stefania.
Hello, good evening.
How are you doing? So Stefania is an investigative journalist and activist and has worked on WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden documents. Instead of me introducing you, why don't you do it? Because you'll be able to do it far better than I will be able to.
Well, actually, I'm not an activist at all, and I'm a journalist. I'm an investigative journalist, and I have struggled hard to get the documentation about the case of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange after having worked for over a decade on the secret documents. And so my goal is to reconstruct the case factually in order to provide evidence really happened in this case and how this case will be devastating for freedom of the press and for the right of the public to know.
Okay. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, would it be okay, Stefania, if you gave a very quick kind of summary for our viewers who might not know the ins and outs? Everybody would have heard of WikiLeaks. Everyone would have heard of Julian Assange. But do you mind just telling us briefly how you'd summarize what's happened so far?
Of course. Very happy to do this. So basically, Julian Assange remained, he's a journalist. He's a journalist who created this media organization. And it's really important to stress this. WikiLeaks is a media organization. It's not a platform, a whistleblowing website. It's a media organization which reveal really important information in the public interest. And this information is basically consists of secret documents, restricted documents, and they have revealed very, very important information in the public interest, like the documents on the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, the documents on Guantanamo. Yesterday, we celebrated the anniversary of Guantanamo, and I was remembering how we got access to this documentation. For the first time, we could know who the detainees are, and why they were there. They were transferred to Guantanamo for what kind of reasons. So all these important revelations have been possible only thanks to the courage of WikiLeaks sources like Chelsea Manning. She's years in prison, tried to commit suicide 3 times. And thanks to the courage of Julian Assange and the WikiLeaks journalists, let's not forget that after publishing this documentation about the US government, about the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo, and the US secret diplomacy cables, Julian Assange has never known freedom again, and he's still in prison. He's in prison in Belmarsh, in a high security prison for very dangerous terrorists. And we don't know what is going to happen if he will be extradited to the US, as he seriously risked to be extradited. He won't get out of the prison again. He won't. I mean, we spend his entire life there and probably commit suicide. That's the real risk.
Okay, wow. I think it's important for us to come back and speak about Julian Assange, his current situation being in Belmarsh.
Yep.
But before we do that, I'm just intrigued to know, Stefania, what, in your mind, from what you know about what's been leaked, what is the most shocking fact or the most shocking area that you've learned about?
Well, there are so many actually, because it's you have to realize why it's so unique, WikiLeaks. What makes it unique? So before WikiLeaks, we could access some secret documents, of course, and the Pentagon Papers revealing the actual information about the Vietnam War were one of these major revelations, secret documents about the war. However, what WikiLeaks did was to make this systematic. They didn't reveal just one document, two documents, three documents, 7,000. They made possible to, to open gaping hole in this secret power. It's a power shrouded in secrecy, where the secrecy is not used to protect citizens, is not used to protect our safety and security. Secrecy is used to protect, to shield state authorities from prosecution, from being accountable. So it's an abuse of secrecy, actually. And these revelations have been so important because they have allowed to see what our governments do when they are protected from public scrutiny. And never before it had been possible to look directly for billions of people having access to this kind of information systematically.
So you can see why he's angered and annoyed and frustrated so many people in very high positions of authority.
Absolutely. He didn't give people a fish. He taught them how to look at it and how to make this systematic and how to provide, how to invite whistleblowers to leak this information. This is why they want him dead. They want these powerful people, the US government, the intelligence community, and all their contractors. They absolutely want to set an example. They want to make these people who might leak and reveal these state crimes and think, well, my life will be destroyed if I do this. So it's better I don't do it,
I suppose another element is to discredit him by making allegations and spreading rumors about things that he's done. Which brings me to my next question. Do you mind telling the viewers a bit about how he's been treated badly? So just describe the horrific treatment of Julian Assange over the years.
Yes, I mean, he has been destroyed, actually. I mean, I have seen all this process from the very beginning because I have been working on the WikiLeaks revelation since 2009, and my first meeting were in 2010. So at the very, very beginning, when he had just published documents like Collateral Murder, the video which revealed this Apache helicopter killing innocent civilian in Baghdad as the helicopter crew was laughing at them, So I was there from the very beginning, and I realized you have to realize that the last time I saw Julian Assange as a free man was the 28th September 2010. After that meeting, I never have met Julian Assange as a free man again. Never. I have worked for over a decade with WikiLeaks for my newspaper, initially the Italian magazine L'Espresso and the Italian daily La Repubblica, and now the Italian daily Il Fatto Quotidiano. I have worked 13 years on the documents. I know I have visited Julian Assange many, many times, And you have to realize that the last time I saw him as a free man was 2010, September 2010. So I have seen his health collapsing. Initially, he was under house arrest. Then he was inside the embassy, 6 years and 10 months, not even an hour outdoor. I mean, we give an hour outdoor to very dangerous mafia people who have done all sorts of horrific things. We give them this an hour outdoor for humanitarian and health reasons. He never got an hour outdoor. He spent 6 years and 10 months inside the embassy. So I have seen his health collapsing and being, seriously depressed.
And do you think he's being targeted whilst he's in detention? So do you think that either inmates or prison guards, do you think there's people behind the scenes that are trying to target him or even physically attack him in prison?
I don't think they need so. I don't think to be especially cruel, because even the detention in a high security prison after 11 years of detention is enough to destroy a man. So you don't need to burn the cigarettes on his arms. You don't need to do special to use special torture techniques or abuses. It's enough to keep inside this high security prison, not to receive visits, not to have exchanges. I mean, he comes from 10 years of arbitrary detention inside an embassy with no serious, no interaction. He had no ability to walk. His interactions were very limited. He was spied. We were spied. All our meetings were, filmed and recorded. So all this treatment add to a very, harsh condition. His harsh condition inside the embassy. So
it sounds like it's easier to break him down mentally rather than physically, and you leave less evidence, right? If you touch somebody mentally.
And you use, as the UN Special Rapporteur Nils Melzer effectively exposed it, you use psychological torture. I mean, in ordinary regimes, you use torture, physical torture.
Yeah.
In democracies, in this case, you use leave no marks torture, psychological torture. Yeah. It's enough to have him, brain dead and destroyed.
And there was, as the viewers will probably know, one part of the controversy of this case is that there were sexual allegations against him. I think it was several years ago now, I believe in Sweden, that he sexually assaulted 2 women. So in your view, is that all part of this smear campaign and the psychological torture? Do you think it was all fabricated?
Oh, actually, it's really important to understand. I have spent years investigating this case in general and in particular the Swedish case, because I have been fighting to get the documentation about the case. And you have to realize that I have spent 6 years and 4 months to get the documentation, litigating in the British courts, in the Swedish courts, in the US courts, in the Australian courts, and all these governments are denying me the access to the documentation. So clearly they have very important things to hide. Otherwise, they would release me the documentation about the case. And what came out from this litigation about the Swedish case? First of all, it came out that it was the Crown Prosecution Service, the UK authorities at the Crown Prosecution Service, which today are in charge of the extradition to the US, by the way. It was the Crown Prosecution Service who told the Swedish prosecutor not to travel to London to question him. And basically, by doing so, they created this limbo, this quagmire, in which Julian Assange was neither charged and so put on trial, and it was not basically discharged. It was not, the investigation was never dropped. So he was put for 9 years in this limbo. And everyone was blaming him for being a rapist, for evading the Swedish justice, when in fact they could have just questioned him and decided whether to charge him. So they put him in this limbo for 9 years, while people was criticizing him, demonizing him, blaming him for this judicial paralysis, when in fact they could have easily solved this case. And
ultimately, the charges were dropped as well, weren't they? In the end,
there were never charges. That's the interesting thing. There were never ever charges. That's the important thing about the case. So the case was kept at this preliminary stage where there never charges, only allegations. And clearly the Swedish prosecutors could have charged him if they had enough evidence. They could have charged him. They could have put him on trial. They never did it.
Okay.
And actually, when they could have done whatever they wanted, because he was basically in April 2019, he was arrested and he was under British custody in Belmarsh. So at that point, the Swedish prosecutor could have done whatever they wanted. They closed the investigation without even questioning him.
Wow.
You know,
Yeah,
so
that really is shocking, isn't it?
This case is really, really important. So it's really important you realize you don't have to think about, about plots, about conspiracy. You have to analyze and read the documents to understand how they use perfect legal techniques and tactics. No plots, no conspiracies, but just the law.
Loopholes that are available. Yeah.
The laws are lawfare against him to do what? To keep him in London for 9 years under heavy surveillance, trapped in an embassy with his health collapsing under heavy surveillance, and with a demonization campaign for being a rapist, evading Swedish justice, and so on. And finally, this Swedish case made possible his arrest in April 19. So the Swedish case was absolutely instrumental in this demonization, destruction of Julian Assange. This is why we have to understand this case very well. We don't have to think in a conspiratorial way. We have to look how lawfare has been used against him.
Okay, thank you for explaining that to us, Stefania. Just going back to something you said, I'm very curious, have either you yourself or any colleagues or any other people who've been investigating this case, have you ever had any kind of pushback or threats, either direct or covert, from the larger authorities at all for putting your nose in the business?
So first of all, this is an important question. First of all, never have I met a colleague who wanted to investigate the case using FOIA and getting access to the documents. No one did it. It took an Italian journalist to discover that the UK authorities at the Crown Prosecution Service had told to the Swedish authorities, don't come here to question him. So, I mean, can you believe that it took an Italian journalist to discover the role of the UK authorities at the Crown Prosecution Service? I suppose my British colleagues have all sorts of tools, resources, and contacts inside the Crown Prosecution Service and the British state authorities, and yet no one did anything. And it took an Italian journalist to go to litigate to Sweden to access for the full documentation. And it took an Italian journalist to go to the US to get the full documentation, and to Australia. Why? Because no one did it. So thousands of journalists covered this case, reported on this case, but no one did it. And
is that because they felt intimidated about what would happen to them, or because they met resistant, or both?
I don't know. Why? I don't know. To be honest, I really don't know. You can see there is so little coverage. And now it's much better. I mean, a lot better. We see The Guardian stepping out and writing editorials, don't extradite Julian Assange. We have seen the New York Times publishing editorials. We have seen the International Federation of Journalists, Reporters Sans Frontières. We have seen many members of parliament stepping out and speaking out for Julian Assange. But as a matter of fact, for the last 11 years, no one tried to look for the truth, and this is to search for the truth. And this is, I mean, it's so highly unusual, about.
There's so many possibilities, isn't there? I mean, you could say the conspiracy goes all the way up to the editors and the publications themselves, or you could say it's intimidation. It just seems very shady. All of it seems very shady.
Exactly.
So, Stefania, you mentioned before about the potential extradition to the United States. I think you briefly mentioned why that would be an absolute travesty. Do you mind expanding on that, please?
Well, of course it is. So you have to realize that the United States trying to extradite him and put him on trial, and they risk 175 years in prison, in the most extreme prison in the US, ADX Florence, under extreme isolation conditions, under a special regime called SAMS, Special Administrative Measures. And the reason why he risks this is because he revealed war crimes, torture, extrajudicial killings by drone. So the only reason why he's charged by the US has nothing to do with Trump, with Russiagate, with nothing like that. It is, the whole case is about publication activities as a media organization, as I said. And the fact that WikiLeaks as a media organization was even acknowledged by a British tribunal during my Freedom of Information litigation. And they said the tribunal established the WikiLeaks as a media organization. So the US is trying to extradite a publisher, a journalist, and to put him in prison for life just for publishing. And he's trying to do this as if he was a drug dealer or maybe a mafia killer. There's no difference at all. If you look at the case, the only reason why the extradition was refused in the first instance by the judge Vanessa Bereitzer is that is only on his health conditions, mental health condition, because the British judge Bereitzer acknowledged that if extradited, he will be at risk of committing suicide. Yeah. There is nothing. She refused any press freedom argument. So the whole case, one of the it's the most important case on press freedom in this century. It's all about his physical conditions, because the judge refused any press freedom arguments. It's unbelievable. And now, after this first instance, we have the High Court sentence saying that, establishing that he can be extradited, because the U.S. authorities provided diplomatic assurances that he won't be treated extremely, he won't be put in the most extreme prison, ADX Florence, he won't be put in the most extreme regime SAMS. But I mean, all serious human rights organizations were very outspoken, and they basically declared that these diplomatic assurances are completely unreliable.
So when you were talking about him going to maximum security prison potentially in the States, that is very confusing to me. So I'm a forensic psychiatrist. I do prison assessments. I've done assessments in Belmarsh before. And also I make recommendations for like high secure hospitals like Broadmoor. And my understanding is that there has to be a logical reason for somebody to go into Supermax. So they've got to be so potentially dangerous that they're either the vast majority of people are at risk of committing extreme violence onto other people, guards, other inmates, or if there's a risk of them trying to escape or something, like they have gang affiliations. I can't see how you could justify that Julian Assange would need those kind of conditions, because he's not a violent man. I mean, he might have caused damage to authorities and governments, but he's not physically hurt anybody. So why would he need Supermax conditions? Doesn't make sense to me.
Well, because according to the U.S. authorities, it's a threat. It's a serious threat to the national security, because he revealed secret information, which, according to the U.S. authorities, put lives at risk.
But even if that's true, even if that is true, and I'm not saying that it is, but that doesn't mean that he's at a risk of hurting people in prison or that he's at a risk of escaping.
Well, the argument is that he is at risk of hurting the state, the security of the state. So, I mean, it's a very dangerous person in their views, you know. And you have to realize that in the last 11 years, where the U.S., in which the U.S. authorities claim that he put lives at risk, he might have blood in his hands and so on, they were never ever able to provide a single example of a person killed or injured or put in prison due to this publication. Quite the opposite. During the trial of Chelsea Manning, the head of the unit in charge of establishing whether there were any damage, when any person killed or injured due to this publication, openly testified that no one was injured, no one was killed, no one was put in prison. So they have, after 11 years, they have never ever found a single example of a person put in danger by these revelations. And they won't find it because at this point, after 11 years, of course, and you can imagine how hard they tried. They tried. I mean, if they just had found anyone who had a little any damage, they would have, you know, they would have made a case all around the hitting headlines.
I agree with you. If there's something there, it would have been found by now. I completely agree. So something that you've mentioned, Stefania, is Julian Assange's risk of suicide. Can you tell us what you think realistically that might be now in his present situation in Belmarsh, and also whether you think that would change if he was to be extradited?
Well, he's in very bad shape. Recently, he had a mini stroke, and so he's in a very precarious situation. And let's not forget that according to the Yahoo News, the CIA planned to kill Julian Assange by poisoning him or kidnapping him. And so we have, thanks to these revelations by Yahoo News, we have a confirmation of what some protected sources had already revealed. And we had just witness statement, but now we have even confirmation from Yahoo News. So you have this man, an innocent man, who revealed war crimes, torture, who will be extradited to a country where the CIA tried to kill him, to poison him, you know?
Wow. Absolutely shocking. Stefania, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Before I ask you a little bit about your social media presence and what you're working on, my last question about the Assange case would be, is there anything that members of the public can do to support him or help his cause at all?
Yes, absolutely. I believe the public is free of his jail because, you know, I don't, at this point, after having worked so many years on the case and having accessed some important documents on the case, I have no trust whatsoever on the legal process. Quite the opposite. I have seen how in the last 11 years the legal process has been used to keep him in jail, to try to kill him by having his health collapsing, his mental and physical health collapsing. So I have no trust on the legal process, on the British courts, on the US courts, and so on. I just trust the European Courts of Human Rights for Human Rights. I trust the UN authorities because they were the only one who tried to protect him, both the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which was the only one to establish that he was under arbitrary detention. As for the rest,
Stefania, sorry to apologies for interrupting you. I just want to give our viewers an opportunity to support you in your work. So do you mind just telling us where we would find you on social media and what you're working on right now?
Yeah, of course. So the public should take to the street and to mobilize, to do whatever they can, protest, write their MP and so on. As for my work, you can read me on my newspaper, Il Fatto Quotidiano. I often publish works on Julian Assange in English as well. And on my Twitter handle, as Maurizzi, where I put some kind of updates and links to my documents. And by 2000, by this year, I will publish my book in English about the case. I work 1 year and 4 months, and it will have a good preface by Ken Loach. So it will be a book where I put all I have done in 13 years of my work on the case.
Wow. Thank you so much for taking your time to explain the situation to us and explaining your involvement and your opinions, possibly starting a riot. We'll see what happens. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, Stefania.
Thanks.
Enjoy the rest of your
Thanks
evening.
for having me. Thank you.
All the best. Goodbye.
Bye.
So Ash, can you help me out here? I don't have any edit capabilities, thank you. So yeah, fascinating case. I'm sure that her story and her opinions will resonate with a lot of you viewers. So please do chase her up on her social media. Okay, let's introduce our next guest. Nama, yes. Nama, apologies. I'm very used to people pronouncing my first name right, so I should make an effort to get it right. So Nama Cates. So Nama, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you'll be speaking about today, please?
Sure. So I have a podcast called Incel, and I started it in July of 2019, though I've been studying this community a little bit longer than that. So since starting it, I don't have a background in anything other than media, but this has gotten me into a world of all kinds of things: violent extremism, psychology, terrorism, and I've become quite an expert on this topic, according to people smarter than me.
Okay, well, I'd love to pick your brains about all of those topics. Before we do that, do you mind if I ask you, Nama, how did you get there? What drew you in to associate with this particular subsect of society?
So I think I just found it fascinating. It's kind of a convergence of taboos. Incels talk about sex and the meaning of life and masculinity, human mating, lookism, all kinds of hypocrisies in society. And then, as you know, there has been some recently association with terrorism with this group, rightly or not, and violence. And so all of those topics were interesting to me. I was looking to start a podcast, and the fact that these are mostly young men who find themselves hideous and never show their faces, I thought would make it kind of a good subject for a podcast too.
Okay, and what was your background before then? You were a musician and an actress, did I get that right?
Yes, and a writer. I also did things behind the scenes, so to speak, for commercials and film. So it was just media generally, acting, music, all that stuff.
And then you make this decision to do a podcast on quite a dark world. So do you mind talking us through what happened and how it developed?
So yeah, I did some sort of cursory research into it. I found that this community exists online. So basically all of their communications and the whole culture and everything exists on these websites that are available for anyone to look at. So, there was a lot of material there. And outside of their sort of source material that they wrote themselves about themselves and, in their discussions, there wasn't really much about them. There were a few kind of mainstream media pieces that were, I would say, apocryphal and kind of sensationalistic about this dark world and how reprehensible it was. But when I started reading their content and their own posts, I guess maybe some of it was a little shocking at first, not even that much to me for whatever reason. And the more I read it, I found a lot of it to be relatable and kind of funny and interesting. Like they asked interesting questions, philosophical kind of existentialist questions.
Do you mind giving us a couple of examples of questions they might have asked that caught your attention?
Yeah, they would ask a lot of questions about, what is the point of living, and what is valued in society as far as manhood, or just being a good person in general, and what's the meaning of life if I can't reproduce and have a girlfriend. And they look at hobbies and things like that as copes. So it's just a lot of these very, I find, relatable questions for young people, and about loneliness a lot too. There was a lot of discussion about that, which I think is a big problem for a lot of people, and an interesting topic.
So
And
the things that you've mentioned so far seem very reasonable. They seem like appropriate thoughts that many people might have. I suppose the incel movement is connected to a bit of a darker philosophy. So from your experience, did you find them asking more disturbing questions, or did you find them promoting ideologies that are potentially dangerous as well?
they would speak in very disturbing ways, a lot of the time, I think, for shock value, about things that I think are actually thoughts that most people have at some point, but aren't maybe willing to admit. They would use all kinds of language that's considered to be dehumanizing language, and I can understand that, to describe women. And they would talk about the way that women are just always want attention, and they're greedy, and they're hypergamous. They always just wait around for the next best thing. They're disloyal, they're manipulative, like pretty awful things about women, and then about society in general being very hypocritical, and that people are superficial. And that talk can get very extreme and outrageous. Again, they're opinions that I think a lot of people, if they were honest with themselves, have sometimes, but the way they're expressed is very extreme. And there would also be ironic sort of posts about either being suicidal or sometimes being homicidal, that were clearly what they call shitposting, were clearly not sincere.
I suppose the problem is, the way I see it, Nama, is that even though some of the people who are posting this material might be doing it in a intentionally provocative or sarcastic manner, there have been, and you alluded to this yourself, some fairly serious cases of murders and killings. So Jake Davison is one that was huge in the UK. I believe it was August last year, the first mass killing in 10 years on UK soil, and he identified as incel. So I suppose my next question to you, and it is a very broad, difficult question, but I'm going to ask it: are incels dangerous?
Well, Jake Davison is a perfect example. I wrote at length about Jake Davison in Unheard and Spiked and some other places. So the conceit is that the incel movement and the incel ideology inspires real-world violence. But if we look at a case like Jake Davison, and most of them, that doesn't really hold. Jake Davison, first of all, was not actually a self-identified incel. He was obviously sympathetic to and protective of incels. He spent time, as I looked through his Reddit history and his YouTube history, reading incel content, but he was also involved with groups that were anti-incel. He referred to the ideology as bullshit. When he would talk about incels, he would say incels or people like me. So that's making a distinction, first of all. If we're talking about this movement being dangerous or being a terroristic movement, then if an individual is clearly not committed and draws a distinction between themselves and the movement, it's hard to say that the movement is what inspired the violence.
What about cases that might align themselves more? So Elliot Rodgers would be one, Alec Manassian. You probably know more about this than I do, but my understanding was that they self-identified with the incel movement. Is that
so? Correct? All of these cases are interesting, and when you take almost all of them apart, that doesn't hold very well. Elliot Rodger, yes. Elliot Rodger also didn't call himself an incel. He didn't use that word, but he was certainly speaking in a way that is what is now associated with the incel movement, and that his killing was supposedly motivated by vengeance against this society with the Chads and the Stacys and all of that. But he didn't use the term. That was the media that first drew that connection, actually, between him and the movement. Everything since Elliot Rodger has been a copycat, Alec Manassian most notably. You know, I wasn't sure what to make of Manassian either, but as the trial, well, when his interrogation footage came out, it was clear that some of the things he was saying about, you know, speaking to Elliot Rodger, for instance, wasn't true. He was lying, he was exaggerating, maybe he believes it himself, but it wasn't true. And the judge on that case, Justice Anne Malloy, Canadian judge, actually in her ruling stated that she was not even going to look at the incel angle when making her ruling and her sentencing, because she felt it was something that he sort of added to his story to gain more notoriety. And I think that's true. When you look at Alec Manassian's history, he was fixated with school shooters and mass shooters of various kinds before he'd ever heard of the term incel. So, you know, again, that really complicates whether we can say that the ideology actually inspires real world violence.
So with looking at the case of Alec Manassian, so just for the viewers that might not know, please correct me, Naama, if you know more details about it than I do, as I'm sure you do. But he was a Canadian who intentionally ran over and killed, I believe it was 10 people in Toronto and injured maybe a dozen, maybe even more. But my understanding, and again, you could tell me I'm wrong, I'd be happy to be corrected, is that the reason that he did that was because he wanted to run over attractive women, because he felt this sense of rejection over years. And I think he said after his arrest that he wished he hurt more pretty blonde women. So my question to you is, isn't that kind of the core of what the incel ideology is about?
Well, first of all, there's nowhere in the incel ideology, and I've spoken to hundreds of them and read a lot of their content, that actually calls for violence. That's not what the ideology is about in any way. The ideology is not very coherent, but I would say it is an ideology. But and it's called the black pill. It doesn't talk about revenge. It doesn't talk about retribution. There's nothing prescriptive in it. It's just this kind of very depressing and fatalistic idea that, you know, people are born on the genetic lottery, you know, drawing a certain lot in life, and that if they are less attractive and, you know, beta males, they will be doomed to this life of misery. None of them believe that there's anything that can be done to change this. So they're not calling for change. The individuals that, let's say, Elliot Rodger or even Alec Manassian, if we're going to say that he is one, though again, I think that some of the things that he said were indeed just to make himself more notorious. He was a copycat. He had been fixated with mass shooters of different kinds, not incels, you know, as a young child before he knew about incels. And he, you know, obviously learned about Elliot Rodger and found that this was a way to, I believe, make his story more, to go out with a blaze and to make himself more notorious, more legendary, more important. And I do think that that's the way he used that.
So it sounds to me that you're saying that the incels are misunderstood and are actually not that dangerous to the public. Is that correct?
Yes, I don't think that they are really much of a danger. Certainly not to national security the way that they're being talked about now. The vast majority of them are, you know, very shy, very, as they would call, high inhibition. A lot of them are on the autism spectrum. There's been research that shows that a staggering percentage of them are, something like 30%. And these are not people that are, you know, taking a lot of risks. They don't interact with women much at all. They're a group that's not likely to be committing a lot of crimes or acting out much. If they are a danger to anyone, it's usually to themselves, as a lot of them are suicidal.
Okay. And I have to ask, has your beliefs changed since you've interacted with them? So I guess what I'm asking is, did you have a certain opinion on what incels would probably be like, and that changed over time, or had you had a preconception which you kept?
I didn't have much of a preconception. I think I felt going in that they would be more nefarious. I definitely thought that they would be less friendly and less interested in talking. I thought they would be a little bit, you know, I was a little bit skeptical over whether or not they were going to be these boogeymen as they've been, presented to be. But I thought that maybe they would have at least a bit more of like a tough exterior, when first entering some kind of dynamic or conversation with me. And I found that that's not rarely the case.
Okay. And you mentioned mental health issues specifically. You mentioned autism. So I'm a forensic psychiatrist, so I do assess people who have autism who commit fairly serious sexual violence. Just to be very clear, I'm not suggesting that the vast majority of people with autism would present like that. It's only a very small minority. But one thing that struck me from my assessments is that there are certain personality traits or presentations of this disorder that would lend itself to potentially sexually offending. So to be specific, not having the social skills to kind of express their sexuality, to flirt with women, to have normal conversations. Sometimes there's sexual frustration and it kind of builds up over time because they don't know how to cope with it. So my question to you is, why do you think that people who are autistic are driven towards this type of underground movement?
I think that's, there are many reasons for it. And I think that it's manifesting not just in fringe movements like incels, but in a lot of sort of online groups, whether they're for, kind of promoting suicide. We see a bit of that, certain body image issues, the way that people on the spectrum relate with online written text-based content is a little bit different because it's harder for them to sort of interface, socially in the real world. Then they find a lot of connection and meaning with online communities. They also tend to have a more fluid sense of self just in general, which can express in a lot of different ways. And I feel like especially young people on the spectrum find an online, community like this, it can become their world, it can very much become their life, and they can very much fuse their identities with those of the other people in the community. So I think we see that manifesting, like I said, in a lot of different ways now, with just kind of trends that you find with young people and the internet. And I think that it's something that we really need to look at and take more seriously, and maybe find some alternatives or find some interventions that can help mitigate some of those, consequences.
So that kind of brings me on to my next question about your personal interactions with incel members. So before I ask about any potential danger level, do you mind just clarifying for the viewers, please, what kind of interactions have you had on your podcast? Like, have you had them on as guests? Have you spoken to them directly? Have you met any in person?
The only incel that I've met in person is the one that sort of started this project for me. And that's an individual that I, had a couple interactions with. And when I was getting interested in this topic, realized that they identified as incel, met in person a few times. And I haven't used any of that content on my show. It just kind of inspired it. So other than that, no. Most of my interactions, sometimes it will be, just one interview for the podcast, sometimes a couple. Usually before that and after that, I like to sort of keep up with people and check in to make sure, they're doing okay. It's strange sometimes to talk about very private things on a podcast. And so I don't usually just kind of cut it off there. But outside of that, there are many incels that just kind of reach out for whatever reason. Maybe they want to talk about the podcast, their own experiences. And, I have ongoing communication with them. It's almost always just online on different apps, all of the apps, Discord and Telegram and Signal and Wire. Like, I have all of them on my phone now since starting this. So, it's mostly that. But I would say that sometimes there are interviews that just cover a certain topic. A lot of times those can be very personal. And I would say that I have the experience of probably a dozen or more incels who, from the time I began talking to them to now, have ascended, as they would say, quote unquote. They've gotten a girlfriend or something. There are a lot of those, and there are some that just, maybe started treatment or kind of started school or repaired relationships with family. So I do watch these people grow in their ambitions, in their lives, and what they do. A lot of
And
them
if they do get girlfriends and start, sexual relationships, do they tend to kind of completely dissociate themselves from their previous way of thinking in the ideology? Like, do they throw away the hat of being incel?
I mean, yes, in most ways. It depends how kind of involved and in it they were. I'd say most of them aren't so involved that most of them are willing to drop any of these beliefs at the drop of a hat as soon as they get some female attention. That's by far the majority. And especially the ones that are the most kind of vocal about it, the ones that try to black pill me the most and repeat talking points are the ones that are just done with it.
Do you mind just explaining for our viewers what that means, blackpilling you?
Blackpilling is to, convince someone of the black pill. So to send studies, to kind of repeat certain arguments. A lot of times these are studies based on, dating app data, or they're little anecdotes from Reddit that don't mean much. Just to prove that the black pill is right, and sub 7 men, as they'd say, or sometimes that's sub 8, like below a certain value, low tier men are doomed to a life of just wage cuckery, as they call it, just working for, whatever end, and getting no pleasure and no meaning out of life.
So with sub 7, I presume that means that they rate themselves as less than 7 out of 10 in terms of looks.
Yes, right. A lot of times they view themselves as much lower than that, and a lot of times those views are quite distorted.
So Nami, you've made it very clear that the vast majority of people that you've spoken to who identify as incel are not dangerous, potentially misunderstood. Has there been any situations where they've said or done something that's made alarm bells ring when you've personally interacted with them?
Yeah, there have been a couple, there have been a couple where I was concerned about the person because of something that they said, a lot of times in terms of their own safety, a lot of sort of suicide scares. One person sent me a meme at one point at a gun range or something, and this was very early on, and I forwarded that actually to forensic psychologists and asked, what I should do about this, and that person turned out to be just messing with me, and also was very young and had a girlfriend within a few months and was just done with it.
No longer suicidal.
Yeah, nope. And then there's one person that kind of went on a bit of a harassment campaign, sort of stalking campaign, is still doing it actually. And this is one that I'd never actually spoken to. I think
so they're stalking you?
Yes.
Oh, wow. How do you feel about that?
Well, it was very scary when it started. It was very disturbing. I didn't know who it was. They were putting posts up on Reddit where the people that would respond, they would give my phone number. So I was getting all these calls from different phone numbers, all hours of the day. It took me a little while to sort of figure out what was going on and get a friend of theirs to basically show me who it was and why they were doing it. And, it seemed like it was just a prank. They were trying to get me to change my number, but it's still.
Do you mind if I ask, did you confront them about this then?
Yes, they knew that I knew it was them at one point. Again, it was someone that I'd never spoken to before that. Their motivation, I don't exactly know. And they didn't admit anything when I spoke to them, but they still message me sometimes and they say the most disturbing things. There were a couple times that I picked up the phone and it was them, and they had this, trying to sound like a Joker type of laugh, but I don't want to give them any more attention. That's all.
Okay, we won't talk about them specifically, but I have to say it feels very magnanimous of you to have been mistreated, I think it's fair to say, but by somebody from the incel movement. But you obviously are not tarnishing the rest of his peers because of that experience.
Yeah, of the hundreds that I've talked to at this point, this is the one person that did anything like that.
Okay.
And I don't know that anyone really supported it, so I don't think it would be fair to, again,
Okay.
you know, you have people that are maybe a little bit sociopathic in any movement, and doesn't really necessarily reflect on the group.
Okay, very, very good point. Well made. So, what should be our take-home message for the viewers watching this about the incel movement? How would you describe it yourself from your personal experiences?
Usually, they are just very shy, socially awkward, and misunderstood kind of young men that get something out of this identity. They define themselves this way, and sometimes that they find community within this group, and they get to vent things that are maybe shameful or embarrassing, that they wouldn't get to otherwise without judgment in this group. So it helps them in that respect. It's also, you know, sometimes it keeps people stuck, I think, or depressed. So as a group, as a community, you know, people can think what they want, but as individuals, these are probably just shy people. You probably know some, you know, in real life. A lot of them are, you know, just young men that have jobs, and a lot of them are in tech and probably doing good work, and they're not monsters. And beware of easy, sensational sounding media stories about this being, you know, something that you need to watch out for around the corner coming to get you. Because if you really look at those stories, it's not true. It doesn't really make sense.
And so there is this perception, as you just alluded to in the media, of the incel movement being full of bad people with really sort of misogynistic and very aggressive views. Have you felt any backlash yourself from making a podcast that promotes or discusses them? So have other people given you any flack or any feedback or?
Oh yeah. I've gotten much more flack from other people than I have from the incels themselves. When the show first started, there were people calling for it to be taken down, you know, that I was platforming dangerous misogynists. I still get comments like that in my reviews all the time. There are occasionally little pieces about me and how I'm trying to whitewash this community as if I benefit from that in any way. So yeah, it's not a popular thing to be doing.
Does it bother you?
Yeah, a little bit. Less so, just because I've gotten used to it, and I realize the way most people think. And, you know, it used to make me second guess myself a bit more. You know, with more time and more experience doing it, I feel sort of more certain about my position. If I think that I'm wrong, I'm always willing to look at that. But, you know, I guess it comes with the territory of doing something like this, which I'm sure you can understand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think trolls are a part of social media platform and YouTube life. Okay, so finally, Nama, can you tell us a little bit about your podcast, where we find it, and other places on social media where we can support your work and see the good things that you're doing?
Sure. So the podcast is called Incel, just Incel. It's Crawlspace Media. That's the network that puts it out. You can find it anywhere you find podcasts, you know, Apple, Google Play, Spotify, all of those. And it's the only one called Incel. My Twitter, which has a lot of discussion on it, is at Incel Project. So at Incel Project. My own personal Twitter mostly has the same content. It's at Namakates. And then I write for Unheard. I write some pieces about incels and other things related to extremism there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I have to say, I did have preconceptions about the incel movement, probably because my interactions with it have been the high-profile cases and the mass shooting and the spree killings. You've maybe challenged some of my thoughts, actually. I'm not saying I've done a complete 180, but you've made me think about some things that I've never really considered before, and that doesn't happen often. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for coming on, and I wish you all the best. Have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
So yeah, that was a fascinating case. As I just said, it's made me question some of my beliefs.
Good to hear it. There's nothing like a revision of the beliefs as we evolve as human beings on our journey of lifelong learning and discovery.
So what's coming up next, Sean?
Right, next we are moving over to Patreon to discuss the M trial, the biggest case in the world, and Prince A. All stuff that we can't report on here. We're going to be resuming in about 10 minutes with Addy Ads and a round table. And then after the round table, we're going to Buting, the lawyer for Stephen Avery, who was one of the stars of the docuseries Making a Murderer. So on our Patreon, we are going to be putting a lot more content up. John Wedger Part 1 and Part 2, they're going up because we couldn't post most of that content to YouTube. We are going to be doing a revised version of Wedger 1 on YouTube. And we're also thinking of allowing the Patreons to send in exclusively questions for the guests each week. And we will be putting that on our Patreon, what the guest answers as some like additional content. Maybe we'll do that with a studio guest as well. So if you want to join us on Patreon, the link is in the description box below the video. If you want to hear the latest on the M trial and Prince A, and Addy Ads was actually in the courtroom while that whole M trial situation was going on. We're going to be speculating about prospective sentence, if she'll get any play on an appeal, the various outcomes from here, basically, and also the theories that she may be about to give up some big names and stuff like that. We're going to see how realistic all that stuff is. So, Dr. Das, huge thank you for what you've done this evening with the first couple of hours there, and you're going to be coming back for Jerry Buting, I believe.
Indeed. Thank you for having me on, Sean, and a big shout out to all the Attwoodians. I hope to see some of you on my channel.
Please support Dr. Das at A Psych for Sore Minds on YouTube. Link is in the description box also. So,
cheers. See you in a bit.
Cheers, everyone. Thanks for watching us this evening. I'll knock Dr. Das off now. Cheers.
Bye.
While I just say a few more little things. Let's see, remove guest. All right, so you may be wondering what's coming up in the next week or so. So tomorrow night, if you're interested in the Freemasons, and I know a lot of people on the channel are, we've got an insider. We've got a Greater Manchester policeman, an undercover cop, who was run out of the police force by a Freemasonic conspiracy. His name is Gary Rogers, and I think you really enjoy that. It's at 6 p.m. tomorrow. Then on Sunday, 6 p.m., we've got Liverpool ex-gangster in London, Darren G, where he flyers Buckingham Palace and tapes his banner to the gates of Buckingham Palace. And also there's a lot of footage from the protest as well. It was a lively day to be in London that day. That's Sunday. The following Thursday, we've got Scotland's dominatrix and power coach, Megara Fury of Glasgow. So not only has she got the dominatrix side, but she is doing groups now to empower people with a particular focus on empowering women. So that's Thursday at 6. Then on the following Sunday, we've got Jamaica's prisons versus Spain's Supermax prisons. And that's a discussion with Tug of War and Chet Sandhu, with Jen and I co-hosting that one. And it does get quite loud and crazy. And I think the following one from that is that we have got, what is it called? It's Shane Taylor Part 2, The Knife Maniac. The Knife Maniac. Yeah, he's back. He found God in prison after committing some heinous crimes, and he's on a positive path now. And it was got a lot of interest on this channel and other interviews he has done. And then, of course, Attwood Unleashed next Wednesday, 6 p.m. So that's what we've got lined up in the next week. We're trying to produce a lot more content. Now I've got the virus out of the way. Now we've got the hackers out of the way. And it's thanks to your love and support that we can keep all this coming. And a huge thank you, particularly to the Patreons as well. to enable us to keep producing this great content. Hope you guys enjoyed Attwood Unleashed this evening, and we will see some of you on Patreon in about 5 or 6 minutes. Thanks for watching. Take care out there. See you next time. Cheers.